My new video is the map tactic for Poland. You guys voted and this map won. Of course I will also have a look at the other maps in the future, but we start with this one. Poland Domination is a tricky map. From both sides the enemy can shoot into your spawn just a few minutes after the start of the match, and especially in higher tier matches the team that spawns on the east side has almost no chance. The village might be the safest place to be, but it is also small and winding. Around every corner can be an enemy, so let's see how one can play this map. Let's start with the east side. Before we have a look at the routes, here are some general tips and information for this side. As you can see, there are several lines of fire that can easily snipe into both of the spawns. Especially in higher tier matches this gets more common since the guns are better, and the laser rangefinder gets the distance with ease. At the beginning of a match you might be safe, but for your second spawn you want to check if one of the spawn points gets camped and then use the other one. In addition, make sure to check those positions while you are in the match and help your team to spawn again. Highlight enemies and inform your team in the chat. When you have a down tier match and your vehicle can brawl, spawn at this point and move immediately to the capture point A. From this side of the map you should not be flanked from this area and only have to focus on the enemy in front of you. I highlighted the position with an eye symbol. Nevertheless, listen for engine sounds and check the minimap what is happening around you. Use the buildings as cover and capture the point. I marked the position of possible enemies with the exclamation mark. For your second key position either stay at this capture point and defend it or move to the capture point B. There will appear more enemies and most of the time the action is in the center of the village. I would not recommend to push beyond the middle of the map when it is early in the match. I have seen so many matches where the teams fought about the capture point B and A. When you want to move to the capture point B, make sure to pass the open area behind the church so that you can use it as solid cover. There will be enemies in this area and jumping back and forth from one point to the other means you have to cross several lines of fire. You want to use solid cover as often as possible doing so. At the capture point B you can move behind that building and capturing the point from here. No need to stay into the open. Have an eye on the capture point C when it is occupied by the enemy. This back and forth will certainly happen a few times. It is helpful to check the minimap and always drive to the other capture point when teammates are present and can help. When it is later in the match and your team has at least the capture point B and A, you can move beyond the middle of the map to the end of the village and prevent the enemy from entering it again. Now let's have a look at the support routes. As mentioned in the beginning of this video, there are several positions where the enemy has a clear line of fire at your spawn, and one of the biggest problems is the capture point C. This is why your first position for the support route from the northeast spawn is at that ridge line. Make sure to move there immediately and have an eye on the position I marked with the eye symbol. At least one enemy player will try to rush towards the capture point C and get an early spot for your spawn. The distance is around 800 meters to this position and 1000 meters to this one. Also have an eye on the capture point B and see if any enemy is trying to capture it. Before we jump to the second key position, let's have a look at another position that is important. It is not much of a route, but you can have a huge impact on the capture point A. Take a fast tank that maybe even has some armor and move to that little wall over here. The lower the profile of the tank is the better. Some gun depression can also help. From here you can have an eye on any enemy that tries to push A on the other street of the village. In addition, you can have an eye on the position I mentioned earlier and prevent the enemy from spawn camping. In higher tier matches you might want to take a detour, but you may not be able to get there ever since the enemy can just snipe at you right at the start of the match. Now let's have a look at the second position for the first support route. You can either go to this position that is a bit down the street close to the church or to the capture point B. Check what your team is doing. When they have control over the capture point A, this most certainly means that the enemy is trying to flank them from the center of the village. So move to the position around the church. Search for solid cover and use the buildings to your advantage. If you feel confident enough, you can stay behind the church. If you have a rather squishy tank, use the buildings around the church. Listen for hostile engine sounds and check the streets in front of you for enemies. You have to secure that area so that the enemy can't get in the back of your team. When there are already enough teammates around here, you can move to B. Be aware that there might be enemies on the sniper hill and use the lake shore to get to B. Use solid cover and capture the point. Also have an eye to your left side. Maybe there are still some enemies. The village is small and winding and therefore dangerous, but it is also the best cover you can get on this map. This is why I like to stay behind my teammates that got a down tier match for my third key position and secure the capture points. Search for remaining enemies in the village and always try to get to a position where you flank the route of the enemy. Try to avoid face-to-face encounters and hide around corners. Highlight enemies you might detect via engine sounds. Once your team is in the last phase of the match and there are teammates at all key positions, it can be very difficult for the enemy to ever get back into the village again. Now let's have a look at maybe the most important support route for this map and from this side. When the enemy has the capture point C, they can snipe at both of your spawns and even into the village. Take a fast tank and make a detour towards the first key position that is before the capture point C. Be aware of the enemies on the sniper hill. They can get there right at the start of the match and shoot you when you try to approach the capture point directly. Use the trees and also the terrain as cover to get to your first key position. However, it is also not completely safe at this position. It is also possible that the enemy takes the long way to shoot out of the forest towards C or even camp directly the spawn point. That is why the first key position of the other support route is so important. First check if you can detect any enemy to your left and have an eye on C. Don't approach it right away. Check the minimap what your team is doing. Only if they are on their way to the second key position, move onwards towards C. Your second key position is the capture point. Use the terrain as solid cover and capture it. Check the positions I marked with the eye symbol for enemies and attack them when they are not focused on you. Also listen for engine sounds behind you. There still might be some remaining enemies. For your third key position, I recommend to stay at the capture point C. From here you can also have an eye on both spawn points of the enemy and the village, but it is not as effective like from the other side. Nevertheless, the team that has the capture point C has a huge advantage over the enemy team. When we now have a look at all the key positions, we see a proper front line for each phase of the match. We also see that the support routes from this side have to ensure that the enemy can't take the capture point C early in the match and block both spawns. The village is small and there is a lot going on here, so make sure to stick with teammates. Before we start with the routes for the team that spawns west, let's have a look at the possible threats. The enemy also has some positions where they have a clear line of fire at the spawns. However, those positions are not as safe like from the other side. For your second spawn from the west side of the map, you also want to check the minimap and see if the enemy is already camping your spawn. When you have a down tier match and a tank that can brawl, use the northwest spawn and drive into the village. From this side of the map, I cannot recommend to use the street that leads straight to the capture point A. The problem is this position. There most certainly will be an enemy behind that little wall. You have some buildings as solid cover and can jump from one position to the next. But you have to focus on two positions doing so, and at one point your side armor will face towards the enemy. This is why you want to use the street in the village. Your first key position is at this corner. Have an eye down that road and make sure that this position is clear before you move on. Your second key position is the capture point A. To get there, use one of the small passages by the houses to your left. Doing so, your front armor faces towards the remote position where the enemy will hide, and you also can turn it towards the capture point A if needed. In addition, you are closer to the small houses that provide solid cover. Fight the enemies and capture the point. You can also drive down the street even further beyond the church, but keep in mind that to your right side there might be enemies around the church, since this is the second key position for the support route from the other side. For your third key position, it is the same as for the other side. Either stay at this capture point and defend it or move to the capture point B. There will appear more enemies and most of the time the action is in the center of the village. I would not recommend to push beyond the middle of the map when it is early in the match. When you want to move to the capture point B, make sure to pass the open area behind the church so that you can use it as solid cover. There will be enemies in this area and jumping from one capture point to the other means you have to cross several lines of fire. You want to use solid cover as often as possible doing so. At the capture point B you can move behind that building and capturing the point from here. Have an eye on the capture point C when it is occupied by the enemy. When it is later in the match, you can also move beyond the village and use the buildings outside of it as cover. I recommend to approach from A. When the enemy has the control over the capture point C, he can easily shoot on your side armor. Now let's have a look at the support routes from this side. The first support route leads into the village. You can either move directly to the capture point B or to a position before the center of the village around the church. I like to move directly to B and capture it. Use the shore of the lake as cover and hide behind the building while you capture the point. Listen for engine sounds around you and have an eye on the first key position from the other side. Also check the minimap what is happening around the capture point C. When you move to the position in the village, see if you can detect enemies in front of you by the church and use the buildings as solid cover. For your second key position you can stay at B and defend it or help your team at the capture point A. Check the minimap and make your decision based on those information. When you want to move towards the capture point A, make sure to check your right side before crossing a street. You can stay behind the church and shoot on the side armor of enemies that want to get beyond the capture point A. Most likely there will be a lot of back and forth between those two capture points. When it is later in the match, you can also move towards a position outside of the village like for the brawl route. Be aware that there still might be some enemies around C, if your team doesn't have that point, and use solid cover to protect your tank. The second support route starts at the southwest spawn. Make a detour and move towards that little tree line around the capture point C. Don't approach directly. You might be lucky in a fast tank, but be aware of this position. Remember, this is the first key position of the hostile support route. When you are in position, check if you can detect an enemy in front of you or around the capture point before moving onwards. When everything is clear, move towards the capture point C. You have no cover when you approach in a direct line, so make sure to use the little forest as cover and check with the binoculars if there are some enemies. Stay held down and capture the point. For the third and last key position for this route, you can stay at the point. As mentioned several times, you have a huge advantage from here. Whatever you do, don't spawn camp. We have an eye on the village, the capture point B and the area in front of it. When we have a look at all the key positions, we see a proper front line for each phase of the match. We also see that it is not that easy to get the capture point A right away and the support has to focus on B. The capture point C can be a huge advantage from this side of the map. I hope I was able to give you some tips on how to play and win this map. Like, subscribe and leave a comment if you want to, and check out my Discord server for more information and to connect with other players. Hope to see you in game soon.